But I suppose I would start by agreeing that a great part of this debate turns on how a lot of the issues are framed. It is, in many ways, a debate over a variety of words. Words like political correctness, like multiculturalism, like diversity, and what these things actually mean. And so I want to, instead of talking about political correctness in my opening, I'd like to just say a few things about multiculturalism and diversity. And I think the most critical point I want to make to you today is that these are euphemisms. Let's start with multiculturalism. Multiculturalism has next to nothing to do with the study of other cultures. I will repeat it. If there's a single thing I'd like you to take with you today, it is that multiculturalism has next to nothing to do with the study of other cultures. That may be a worthwhile thing to do in an increasingly global world, but that's not what it is about. You do not see students protesting on college campuses demanding missionary postings in third world countries to learn more about other societies. You do not have protests demanding more rigorous foreign language requirements where people will protest to learn Chinese or Swahili or Russian or anything of that sort. Again, it has nothing to do with other cultures. The same, I think, is true of diversity. This is another one of these incredibly misleading euphemistic terms. It does not, to put it charitably, have much to do with a diversity of ideas. You do not have real diversity on a college campus when you have a campus full of people who look different but think alike. And again, I think this is very, very important as a starting point in framing the issue. Well, the question then becomes, well, what are these things really about? What is multiculturalism really about? And I will suggest to you that the single most important theme that runs through much that goes under the rubric of multicultural is that it is anti-Western. It is not non-Western. It is still focused very much on our own society, but it is primarily a vehicle for denouncing it. At Stanford University, which is the one I'm the most familiar with, but I think is certainly no exception to the rule, the debate over multiculturalism in the late 80s started with a protest. The protest was against Western culture. The notorious chant was, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's gotta go." It was not a demand for inclusion, it was a demand for exclusion. Now, why does Western culture have to go? What is the problem with multiculturalism? And what problem does it have? The basic problem, the basic claim is the West is uniquely bad because it is racist, it is sexist, it is oppressive in a variety of other ways. And not only does it have all these problems, but it has them in a way that is far worse than other societies. That's where I think things get very, very problematic. The multicultural educator at Stanford University liked to go around saying, I started looking for racism everywhere, and I started finding racism everywhere. And indeed, he did. If you start looking for anything everywhere, you will start finding it everywhere. If you are a feminist, and if you believe that everything that is longer than it is wide is a symbol of male oppression, then you will start finding sexism everywhere. If you want to find baseball everywhere, you can find baseball everywhere. And similarly, he could find racism everywhere. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how this process played out. There was an ongoing debate over boycotting table grapes. The fact that table grapes were served in student residences was viewed as evidence of racism. Why? Well, because most of the grape pickers in California happened to be Latino farm workers, and they were exposed to dangerous pesticides, supposedly. Now, the fact that a grape boycott would get rid of their jobs was sort of irrelevant because, again, many of these things involve more moral posturing than real substantive concerns over these issues. There was similarly a debate over what students are politically correct, politically incorrect. And again, if we want to talk about examples of political correctness, the Black Student Union at Stanford for a number of years maintained something called a blacklist of students that were insufficiently black, of black students who were insufficiently black, which meant that they did not have the ideological views that multiculturalism claims all blacks must hold. Multiculturalism does not have to do with biology, it has to do with ideology. And the ideology across the board is this far left ideology. Now, I'll tell you what the problem is with looking for racism everywhere. Because when you start looking for racism everywhere and you start finding racism everywhere, it's only a very small step to finding racists everywhere. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if those racists are really out there. but I'm going to suggest to you that they really aren't. The problems of racism, sexism, other forms of oppression have been vastly exaggerated, and as a result, people get unjustly accused. A culture of complaint leads to a culture of blame, and that is ultimately the real problem with it. Let me just make one last comment, then we'll go on from here. The other point that, and along these lines, let me suggest to you that multiculturalism and political correctness must be thought of as different sides of the same coin. The multicultural side is the side where we look for the victims. The politically correct side is the side where we go after the victimizers. The two are inextricably interconnected. You are not going, and that is why you will find the people who are the most multicultural are also the most politically correct. I do think things have gone way too far in the other direction today, where we have this sort of scorched earth strategy being waged against our own society, and I think we have to find some sort of balance between the two. Now, it's always difficult to know exactly where you draw the balance, but I'd suggest to you one indicator, and I think one very important salient feature is, of course, that this whole multicultural debate over looking at racism, sexism, other forms of oppression is something that could only take place within the context of Western civilization, within the context of the civilization where individual rights, individual human rights became possible. And multiculturalists go too far when they forget that the very rhetoric that animates their debate is the rhetoric of the West. And they always forget this. They always forget it. So I do think they go too far, at least in that one extremely salient regard. Now, again, there's a question of emphasis. How far does it really go in practice? I will suggest to you that the reason the chant, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's gotta go, was so powerful was because it actually referred to two different things. It referred to a class, and it referred to the culture that was being studied in the class. It incredibly succinctly encapsulated what people in higher education had been saying for quite a long time, and the tenor with which they had been saying it. You said a few other things about speech codes. This is sort of the bigger problem, is that on a lot of these college campuses we have speech codes where people feel they cannot debate topics and so on. And it is true that these speech codes are often not very rigorously enforced. They're not very precise. They are, in fact, it's often very unclear what you can say and what you cannot say. But I will suggest to you they have a tremendous stifling effect nonetheless, because the way these speech codes work in practice is that you as a student will err on the side of silence. They are incredibly inhibiting of controversial discourse. The point of the Keith Raboy episode, just to sort of provide the details that John omitted, was that it was sort of Keith was, perhaps this was the wrong thing to do, but he attempted to create a test case of the speech code. And his speech did not, strictly speaking, fall out. It was, strictly speaking, still protected under the speech code at Stanford, but at the same time, the point is there are very few people who say things like Keith, who feel free to say those things, or who would say those things if they were not trying to create a test case. There is no problem of racist speech on campus. There is no problem with racism. There is no problem with sexism. Or to the extent there is a problem, it is not very big. One of the reasons multiculturalism was able to get off the ground in the first place is that most college-age students, and especially those who are attending our top universities, are not bigots. There are very few who are. And so I think one of the really big problems we have to come to grips with is this sense in which the reason we have racial tensions in our society, the reason we have other kinds of tensions, is not because there is a problem with racism and other forms of oppression, but because people are looking for these things too much. If you are dealing with a multicultural educator who is looking for racism everywhere and who's finding racism everywhere, then I think one of the things you might do is you might just stay clear of that person. Because whatever you're going to say, if you ask them about racism, well, that's evidence of racism. If you don't ask them about racism, that's evidence that you're not interested in that you're racist. It's a no-win, you-lose situation. You will stay totally clear of that whole debate. And so I will suggest to you one of the reasons we do have some tensions between different groups of people in our society is, in fact, precisely because the focus on these issues has become so misplaced. In many ways, the cure is worse than the disease at this point. John also said some very interesting things about sort of his examples of conservative correctness, and I'm not going to sit here and defend everything that everyone who's conservative or claims to be conservative has said or done in the last 20 or 30 years, but I will suggest that the scope of the problem is primarily a problem of the left, and this is simply numerically the case. If you look at the breakdown of people who are teaching in higher education, most of them are liberal, most of them are on the far left end of the political spectrum. Again, Stanford's very representative in this regard. In the humanities departments, by political party affiliation, you had about 80% plus Democrats, 10% independents, and fewer than 10% Republicans. And that understates the ideological bias because the Republicans tend to be middle-of-the-road Republicans. The Democrats tend to be very far to the left of the Democratic Party. There is an interesting theoretical question. If conservatives controlled these institutions of education, would they behave any better than the liberals are now behaving? I do not know the answer to that, but that's not what we're debating today. We're debating what's actually happening, and what's actually the case is, of course, that the problem is primarily one on the left, primarily because most of the people are, in fact, liberals, and you have to go to some very small, exceptional colleges to find a different pattern. I personally would say that a religious school is in a somewhat different category, that a religious school can impose standards. It can say, we are not going to have someone who is pro-choice teaching in a Catholic university. If that would seem to me to be a matter that is totally up to the private university. However, and again, this debate is primarily about what's happening at the leading large universities, the major public universities, and some of the leading private universities. And they do not advertise themselves as liberal institutions. They advertise themselves as open-minded, diverse institutions. And so I would suggest to you, I would be quite happy if we just had some truth in advertising. If we are going to be enforcing a liberal orthodoxy, then let us say so. And if you are willing to say so, and you have a private university that receives no government funding or virtually no government funding, you have a right to do that. But you should not go around suggesting you're inclusive and open-minded when that is one of the furthest things from the truth. Finally, let me make one other comment on sort of this question about all these politically correct anecdotes, whether these anecdotes are true or false, whether Lynn Cheney got her details wrong on page 200-something, and so on. I am sure that some of the anecdotes may have been exaggerated in the retelling. That's quite conceivable. But I will suggest to you, John, that this latest politically correct line, there's no such thing as political correctness, is ultimately just not going to wash. And the reason it's not going to wash is not because there are lots and lots of different anecdotes and I'm going to overwhelm you with dozens of them, although, I could spend the next 3 hours telling you one anecdote after another, like the blacklist, like the grape boycott, et cetera, down the line. But the reason it's not going to wash is that the reason people believe these anecdotes is not because there is a conservative, heterosexual, white male conspiracy to spread these anecdotes. It is because most people in their day-to-day lives have experienced something like it. Maybe not quite as bad as what happened to, say, a cafeteria worker at Stanford who still served grapes and was pelted with them one day. They were a little bit behind the times. Or perhaps not quite as bad as the students who made the blacklist and were shunned for their 4 years as an undergraduate education. But people have experienced things that are close enough to this. And that is why I think we see a very broad coalition against political correctness. It's not just conservatives. It is also a lot of liberals, say liberals who may be pro-life on an issue, people who do not necessarily fit a well-defined ideological box. They get hammered on those issues, they get hammered on other issues, and that's why a lot of people are saying enough is enough. In putting together the diversity myth, one of the interesting things my co-author and I found was that we got some of the most enthusiastic support from people who would be considered on the liberal or moderate end of the political spectrum. They're often the ones who are in academia. They're the traditional academics who tend to be politically quite liberal, but who don't necessarily want to follow this hard left party line. And they have simply had it. And that's why there is this debate about political correctness, and that's why we're going to have to do something about the problem. Thank you.